I This is someone that I've known for a whole bunch of years. She's a very good friend. She has an amazing collection of cats. I would suggest that if you lobby for a new CSS measurement unit, she will be legally obligated to get another cat and name it after it. So I'll let her explain that at some point. But Rachel Andrew is a web developer and technical writer and editor. I'm currently working for Google on the Chrome team as a staff technical writer and content lead for web.dev and developer.chrome.com. But prior to that, she spent 20 years being still the most knowledgeable person I know on the web and contributing in so many incredible ways to all of us, learning about CSS Grid, about Flexbox, about every other imaginable new thing and layout. Rachel, it makes me so happy to welcome you to this event. It's so good to see you. Can't wait to see what you have to say. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. And it's a shame that we are not in person because Jason's always the person to follow for the best coffee when we are in person. So it's I have to sort my own coffee out while we're remote. But yeah, so well, after that intro, I don't need to introduce myself. But yeah, I'm Rachel Andrew, and I am going to talk a bit about now and next in responsive design. So the things that we have now, the things that work well in browsers that we can be using, and the stuff that is coming soon, the things that are coming to the platform, actually probably a lot faster than you might think. So it's actually been a long time that we've been doing responsive design. Depending on how long you've been doing this, it might seem like a very short time, but it's actually been a long time. Apple released the first iPhone in 2007. As I was saying, this kind of sort of blew everything up for web designers because we thought that everyone was going to get, enormous screens, loads of bandwidth, and instead we ended up with people on tiny, tiny screens and with very limited bandwidth. And so, this sort of idea of how we were going to be designing was all thrown up into the air and messed up. And so responsive web design was the neatly packaged answer to that problem. And the brilliance of what Ethan Marcotte did with this idea shouldn't be underestimated because none of this was new. Other people had been talking about the component parts of responsive design for some time, but it took someone to take those things and create, a bigger picture out of it, give it a name, and to change the way we did web design, right up to today. Now, as we're going to see, these concepts have become part of the underlying technologies. CSS has evolved. And in order to support the responsive web, and because of that, we need to think about how we design responsively and revisit those techniques. We need to evolve what it is to do responsive design. Because we've been calculating percentages for floated layouts or allowing a framework to do it for us, we've been squishing images. After a while, we got the help of responsive images, so we weren't forcing mobile devices to download desktop-sized images. And of course, we've been relying very heavily on media queries for absolutely everything from layout to type. But everything changed. And at first, a lot of people didn't notice. Multiple column layout, a very early CSS3 spec, had flexible columns built right in. If you set a column count, the browser works out how much space to give each of the columns. They're a flexible grid by default. And Flexbox took this idea of just distributing space across columns too. And as soon as people saw Flexbox, they grabbed it with both hands and basically tried to turn it into Float Plus, using the same techniques that we'd used in Float, but with Flexbox. But while Flexbox can respond to the container width, it's also responsive to the content. So take the thing that happens if you simply declare display flex on an element which contains 3 different items. Do you get 3 equal-sized columns? Might sometimes look like it, but no. If there's more space than needed in the flex container to lay the items out at their maximum width, they will each lay out at maximum width, and any spare space is just left after them. If there's not enough space to lay them out at maximum width, they're laid out with more space given to the larger item and less space given to the smaller ones. So the real genius of Flexbox is that we can take a bunch of things which are different sizes and just ask the browser to lay them out using Flexbox, and it will share out the space in a good way that makes those things readable. Now with floats, unless you knew what your content was in advance, There wasn't any way to do this. Flexbox uses a default flex basis of auto, and auto looks at the size of the content. It looks at the max content size. And this is the size you get if your sentence all unravels and does no wrapping. It becomes as big as it can be. So that's why when there's enough space, our words display on one line as flex items. So when there's not enough space for them to display at max content size, Flexbox starts taking space away from the items. Because the flex basis is auto, the large item has already been given more space than the small one. And so as the shrinking happens, it happens from those initial sizes. So by the time all the items fit, the larger item still has a bigger share than the smaller ones. So it's kind of a sensible sort of layout. And you see, not every component needs to be lined up with everything else. Sometimes we just need our content to fit in the best way possible. Flexbox allows us to be responsive in the traditional sense to available screen real estate, but also responsive in terms of the content that we're trying to lay out. But what if you do want a strict grid? 12 and 16 column grid systems have always been really popular. These used to be float-based and then became flex-based, restricting Flexbox away from that sort of squishy sizing to be able to create regular columns. Now, with CSS grid layout, these grids become really easy to create. And that really makes the need for a separate grid system to do calculations for you redundant. If you want a 12-column grid, you can do it just like this. The FR unit gives us flexible, responsive track sizing. A single line of code gives us 12 tracks, each taking the same portion of available space. But it's not quite as it seems, because grid also has this content-based sizing baked in. 12 1FR tracks are really 12 tracks with a minimum size of auto and a maximum size of 1FR. So it's like if you're using min-max here with min-max auto 1FR. Now, in most cases, it doesn't make any difference. You have 12 1FR tracks, you're not going to see anything different. But in this case, I've got my 12-column grid. I've not done any placement, so grid is just doing auto placement. I've got a longer item, and it needs more space to prevent overflows. So it gets that extra space, and the other items become smaller to compensate. So just as with Flexbox, when the flex basis is auto, grid is laying out the content first, then assigning the available space. Now, if you are building a strict grid, you don't want the chance of some columns accidentally becoming bigger than expected. So you can ensure this sizing from auto doesn't happen by explicitly creating your columns like so. So here we're setting the minimum value to 0, so the items have no size at all, and all the space is shared out. So with that minimum size 0 and all the space shared out, you're going to get an overflow if something is too big. But if you're doing this kind of thing, you're probably spanning grid tracks with your items, and so that's not going to be a problem. But if you decide to use the functionality, the FR unit is flexible by default. You don't need to worry about calculating percentages like in the past. There's no chance of ending up with more than 100%. So the starting point for a lot of people when they start using grid layout is to recreate those 12 or 16 column grids. But we've already seen that grid can take the size of the content into consideration when defining tracks. Now in grid layout, you're always dealing in 2 dimensions. Therefore, if an item affects the size of one cell, it's going to change, the rest of the row, for example. But responding to content in a grid context can enable many layout patterns, because a track which is auto-sized will grow big enough to fit the content placed into it. Now you see this obviously with rows. If you don't define sizing for row tracks, they grow as big as they need to be to take all of the content, because tracks in the implicit grid use auto as their size. So what happens with columns? And we already looked at a set of flex items with not enough content to fill the container. As in their case, the flex basis of auto, they all laid out a max content size and the spare space was left empty. They didn't grow to fill the container. In grid layout, the behavior is slightly different. So here I've got a 3-column track grid. All columns are auto-sized. I've auto-placed 5 items into that grid. The content in the columns is small enough so it does fill the container, yet the tracks have stretched. So this is the first thing to understand. auto-sized tracks will stretch by default to fill the container. So that means that the value of justified content in this case is stretch. Now that's different to Flexbox because there the items line up to flex start initially. And you can see that in this case, in grid, if I set justify content to start, the tracks now line up at the start. Their content displays at max content, leaving the spare space at the end of the container. In the case of content that fills the container, a similar thing will happen when using auto-sized tracks in grid, as when using tracks with the flex spaces of auto in Flexbox. Larger content means the track gets more space, but grid works this distribution out in a different way. And that's kind of made obvious if we go back to our 12-column example again. If we split up the words, they can they go to min content size, and grid only adds just enough content to not cause an overflow in that track. So grid basically adds space from min content. Flexbox takes away from max content. So the top here is flex, removing space from max content. Bottom is grid, which adds space from min content. And you can see there's this subtle difference there, where on the bottom line, grid has added space. So those items have actually managed to get themselves to max content size rather than shrinking down. And in grid, you can also use these concepts of min content and max content. You can directly ask a track to be min content, and it will display as small as it possibly can. You can ask a track to be max content, in which case it will display as large as it can. It'll do no wrapping. It might even cause overflows if it's too big. And then we have the handy fit content, which can give you a way to make more responsive components that will cope with a variety of content sizes being added to them. So for example, if you've got like a media object on your site, and you might use those around in various contexts, sometimes they're going to have a big image and some text. Other times, perhaps as a comment form, you might have like a little icon or avatar and wider text. Now, you could create two components or put a class on your component and change the CSS. But with fit content and grid layout, I can use a single component and allow the content to decide how big the track should be. So I've said fit content 300 pixels for my first track. That means that track will never get bigger than 300 pixels, but it could be smaller if the image is smaller in the case of an icon. So that means that the same CSS can lay out these two components. So the first one is smaller than 300 pixels, so it goes to max content. The second image is massive, but it has max width 100%, and so when it gets to 300 pixels, it just sizes down to fit in the track, as you'd expect. So then, media queries. Responsive design was basically enabled by the media query. Without being able to fork our CSS and do different things at different breakpoints, we would have been left with flexible layouts, but not responsive ones. But I think our new layout techniques, our reliance on the media query is decreasing. Again, multiple column layout heralded this change. The column width property creates as many columns as will fit in the container at a particular minimum size. More space, you get more columns, but it's not an exact size. The extra space is shared out amongst the columns that are there. Flexbox can wrap items onto multiple flex lines, which means if you have a set of things that you want to display in this manner rather than lined up, Flexbox will work out how many can go on each line and change if the screen real estate changes. With grid, we can create two-dimensional layouts, filling a container with as many items that will fit while retaining alignment in rows and columns with a flexible grid. That means any layout which is basically a set of boxes, your products, your photographs, they can be made responsive with that one line of CSS, and you'll get fewer columns as the screen real estate shrinks. So before you add a breakpoint, consider whether you really need a media query at all. Sometimes using Flexbox and grid can give you an optimal result without needing to do anything else. But of course, these layouts can be enhanced by using media queries. With grid layout, you have the option of redefining the grid or maintaining a certain number of columns and changing where the things are placed on the grid, how many columns that they span. Now, I think my favorite way of using grid and media queries is when using grid template areas. You can define a component and then redefine it in CSS, but you can see how the component looks right there in CSS. So we might have a sort of narrow view, which looks a bit like this. And then we just redefine that once we've got enough space for the 2 columns. And you can see that there in the CSS, and you end up with something like this. So it's definitely worth, trying to do things perhaps without the media queries, using what's there in Grid and Flexbox, but then seeing where you can put them in and where you can redefine things in your CSS to create nice layouts for your components. But it's not just screen size. The media queries we've been looking at for responsive design and we've used, for all of the past how many years, since that first article, they come from media queries level 3. Now, there's a new media query specification, which has lots of new media features involved, which let us respond to different things about the user's environment. Because it turns out that screen size today is a pretty rough way to decide what type of device a user is on and the way they're working with it. Many small screen devices are incredibly capable mini computers. So a user might be working on their phone, but have an external keyboard and mouse, and be perfectly capable of clicking on those small elements. A user might also have a big tablet, lots of screen real estate, so they don't want a compressed layout, but they're using their finger as the pointing device, so they don't have the ability to hover, for example. So actually, there's other things we might want to look at than just the size of the screen. And so this is changing, and these things are all supported in current browsers. So we can actually look at the type of pointer that the person has. A coarse pointer is if you're using a finger on a touch screen, and a fine pointer would be a trackpad or a mouse, something that can precisely click on things. We can test to see if the visitor can hover, perhaps before doing something that requires hover to make content appear. And so again, using media queries here to test to see if someone can hover. And so that gives you a bit more information. The pointer size and whether they can hover gives you some really useful information about how they're interacting with the device. So you have this whole bunch of ways to figure out what your visitor is dealing with when they're using your site or application. And so we've got level 4, we've also got media queries level 5 and features which ask what the user wants. Now, these are user preference media features, and these typically require that the user has set some preference in their operating system, which the browser can identify and allow us to serve them a version according to that preference. A couple of features that are well implemented are prefers reduced motion and prefers color scheme. So we can have a little look at prefers reduced motion. Now, the values are no preference, which is the default. The person hasn't set any preference for motion in their device, or reduce. Now, if they've set reduce, that means they want minimal animation. So you can honor these wishes and either tame the animation. It doesn't necessarily mean no animation. It could just mean you have a much subtler animation, or completely stop any animations. And this is for people who really struggle with motion in their device. So if you did want to just turn off the animations, this is obviously a very rough example. You could just set animation to none, but you could obviously, just tone things down or remove the most intrusive animations. It's something you need to test really with users. But again, now we're looking at what the preferences the user has and helping them out and doing the sort of the right thing for them. So everything I've mentioned so far, well supported in all 3 engines and cross-browser. But we're now going to head into newer territory. This is the next part. Now, actually, all of the stuff I'm going to show you has pretty good browser support. It's basically all supported in 2 out of 3 engines, and they're all things that are being worked on by the missing engine. So you're not going to have to wait too long for all of these things. I'm going to start quickly with the new syntax for range media queries. And now this adds support for mathematical operators, which is just kind of nice. Instead of this having to test for min width, we can do this. So we can just say width is greater than 600 pixels, or width is greater than or equal to 600 pixels, or whatever you need. So they're just sort of slightly nicer syntax for media queries. To say that's now supported in a couple of browsers, and hopefully that will be supported everywhere soon. And then I guess the big one that everyone has been waiting for is container or element queries. Now, every time I've spoken about CSS, really since the last 10 years, I think, probably, people have said, hey, when are we going to get container queries? And for a long time, we thought we probably weren't going to get container queries because of the problems of actually implementing something where your outer relies on something of the size of the inside. You can sort of end up with loops. But it's kind of been figured out. And it's now this very, very simple and easy to use spec, which is available in Chrome and Safari at the moment, and hopefully coming soon to Firefox. So to use container queries, you first have to make something a container. And we do that by, at the moment, we've only got size-based queries. There are other types of queries coming. But for your size-based queries, you'll say container type, inline size. You can also name your container. So you can say container type inline size and give it a name. That's optional, but it means that if you want to query something that other than the direct container of your item, that allows you to do it. You can actually target the name. And really, once you've set up your container, you can use container queries pretty much in the same way as you'd use your media queries. If you're just querying that first container after the item, use container instead of media, so it looks more or less the same. And you can query a container by its name. So that, let's say, lets you skip the immediate container. So in this example, my examples are all online, by the way, there'll be a URL at the end. I've got a narrow and a wider wrapper, made them both a container and dropped the same component in. The component uses container query to test the size of the container and rearranges itself accordingly. And that's it. Very, very simple in use. Was very, very hard to get working. There's been a lot of people doing a lot of work to actually get this to work, but that's now coming, and you hopefully be able to start using that fairly soon. And then we have subgrid. Again, we've got two browsers. It's Chrome is the missing browser at the moment, but it is being worked on by the Microsoft team into Chromium. I've been waiting a very long time for us to get subgrid. So how does this work? Subgrid doesn't involve any new grid properties. It's a value for grid template columns and grid template rows. If you give either of those properties a value of subgrid and the container is a grid that spans over some tracks, the size and number of grid tracks is inherited in that dimension. So if I've got a parent grid with 12 columns and 4 rows, the grid item is placed from column line 4 to 8 and row line 2 to 4. So this item is now a grid with 4 column tracks and 2 row tracks lined up with the grid lines of the parent. So I've got this in DevTools here. I've highlighted the parent grid with the 12 column and 4 row tracks. The subgridded item has got a border so you can see where it is. And I've got an item inside the subgrid and an item outside the subgrid, and they both line up with each other. And if I highlight the subgrid, you can see how that grid has the column and row tracks defined from the parent because we've created a subgrid for both columns and rows, which is optional. You can just have a subgrid on one or the other if you want. And you can kind of see how those items have been placed and also how the grid line numbers restart inside the subgrid. So it's like an independent grid, as if you just nested one grid inside the other, but the sizing and the number of tracks is being inherited from the parent. Now, I think subgrid is going to be really useful for responsive design when it's combined with container queries, because you'll be able to switch on this subgrid behavior when it makes sense to use it based on the available space that you've got. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm only creating a grid on my item and making it into a subgrid once I know I've got some space. So here, the element spans 2 tracks and isn't using subgrid. So it's just sort of there. It's not taking any notice of the parent grid because it's actually stretched over the 2. It's just sort of displaying inline as block layout basics. It's not a grid. But once it gets wider, I make it a grid layout. I use subgrid, and so it displays and uses the 2 tracks. So something like this would allow components to line up with each other, line up with the tracks of a parent grid. Even though they're nested down inside the structure. I think there's going to be lots to play with there with the combination of subgrid and container queries. At the moment, you need to use Safari to do that. That's the only browser that's got both subgrid and container queries implemented at once. But I think there's going to be lots of little use cases to come up with there and should be able to help make really nice responsive components. And finally, just because I was talking about impossible things, I think another thing that we thought might be impossible would be some kind of parent selector, the ability to select a container based on things that are inside it. So as a quick example, I want to select all the LI elements, but only if they've got an H2 heading inside. That's what this would do. So you've got your parent selector has, and then whatever the selector is that you're looking for. So what are you looking for that this has inside it? Now, again, this is going to be really useful for components. Will work very nicely alongside container queries. So in this demo, I've got a card component. Now, the card might contain a few different things. It might have a figure with a caption. It might contain some text. It might contain a figure and the text. And I want to have different layouts depending on what's inside. And also at different breakpoints, I might want to do different things. So I can put this card into all sorts of places in my layout, and it will look good no matter what size of space it's got, but also whatever's inside it. And so that's what I'm doing here. I've got my container query. I'm saying, well, once I've got 500 pixels, if my card has a figure and content, then let's go to grid layout, use grid template columns. I've got a smaller column and a larger one and a gap. And that's letting me sort of do something like this. So if I've got my figure and the text, I've got 2 columns. If I only have text, I just have the 1 column. So I don't end up with this thing where I've got 2 columns all the time and the text gets stuck in 1 column of it because we didn't know it was there. So I think, that's going to be a really nice way of creating these reusable components. I really can't wait to see how this is used in design systems and so on, because I think it's going to make things so much easier. We're not going to have to sort of whack a load of classes onto things to say, oh, this has a video, or this has an image, or this has a text and an image. We'll be able to actually do that with CSS, detect things from CSS, then use CSS to lay them out appropriately. I think this is going to be really interesting, and I just can't wait to see the sort of stuff that people do with it. So what does it mean to do responsive design today? The basic things of Ethan's original article still hold true. We are still creating flexible grids. We're still, flexible images and responding to available screen real estate. But we've got a lot more. We can start by creating components that respond to the content. So that's flex items and grid tracks that grow and shrink to make the best use of screen real estate and the best use of the content that we're using. But also things like having a look and seeing what content we've actually got, and making decisions based on what's actually inside the component. We've got better and less fragile ways to create flexible grids, whether we want those to respond to the content or more traditionally respond to the available screen real estate. Our new layout methods bring with them built-in responsiveness. So even if we are responding to screen real estate or component real estate, we can do better things than just use percentages and hope that we don't end up with things breaking out of the box. Media queries themselves have evolved, and they're giving us better ways to enhance what we have. We can find out what our user wants. We can ask them, if they want less motion, if they want a certain color scheme, we can ask them these things and actually, give them what they need. And we can check what people are using and respond to that as well, what kind of device they've got. Those new media features let us optimize in different ways, depending on what people have. So, it's not just about screen size. It's not just about component size with container queries. There's lots of different things that we can look at to provide the best experience to our users. We can respond to the needs of our visitor and the environment they're in right now, whether that's technical limitations of their device or browser, the light level, their very expensive data connection. I'm really pleased that we've finally got some of the things we've wanted in the platform for such a long time, container queries, subgrid, a parent selector. But do remember that we have more than just available space to consider in responsive design today. I think something that's happened over the years, really, as long as I've been doing web development, I've heard people express this sentiment that things will be better once the users upgrade their browser, once they have better hardware, once they've got bigger screens or faster data. What people are complaining about changes, but the sentiment is the same. The user should fix things in order to view our site. And the new responsive design gives us so many ways to meet the user exactly where they are, to bring our sites and applications to them, and to meet their needs now, and to place the person using the site at the heart of everything that we do. So thank you very much. And you should find my examples and resources at that URL.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you, everybody, for bearing with us. You included, Rachel, with our technical difficulties. We're getting it sorted out. I can't really thank Matt enough. He had really nice hair before the event started. Not really sure he still has any left, but it's all good. Okay, so we have to keep the Q&A pretty short. I've got one that I want to ask you. I mean, one of the things that you alluded to with something like the parent selector, what made that possible was a lot of advancements in the efficiency of the way browsers handle that kind of sort of looking up and down to see where things are. I've got one thing in mind about a similar kind of problem, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. We have these issues of this kind of recursive back and forth that could cause reflow of the page if it doesn't get figured out quickly. I would love to see better typographic control around things like orphans and widows and paragraphs, and the handling of that across multi-column. Is that something that you see browsers working on right now at all? Or is that stuff still kind of languishing with nerds like me whining about it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, there has been a whole bunch of work with fragmentation. So actually, in the next version of Chrome in 108, break inside a void and break before a void, that value of fragmentation is going to be supported. And again, that was another thing that was made possible by the Layout NG project that Chrome have been doing, where they've rewritten the rendering engine to actually enable a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, and orphans and widows and things are part of this same issue of fragmentation. Yeah, there's lots of issues with fragmentation still. I mean, if you try and print a page with grid or flex or what have you, you will find those issues. Multi-column layout is basically a fragmentation spec too. Multi-column boxes are essentially like printed pages in terms of the way they're laid out. And so it has the same issues as when you try and print things from the web and discover that you end up with all sorts of weird breaking issues. So I think they are being worked on, and I'm co-editor of the multi-column spec, so I would very much like to have fragmentation better supported in browsers, because most of the issues I see with multi-col are actually to do with fragmentation, and things just ending up where you didn't want them. So yeah, that it is something that is getting better, and again, because of these advancements in browser engines. But fragmentation turns out to be hard. So yeah, it's something I would definitely like to look more at, because I think that, I mean, I care a lot about CSS for print as well. There's lots of books and things are printed using CSS, but they're using specific rendering engines for print. And I would love it if the browsers, would support all of this stuff as well, because that could be really powerful in terms of just generating invoices and stuff from the web, and things, with all the things we do have to do.
Yeah, honestly, the most reliable printing from the web thing I ever did was actually printing out of Flash, which weirdly enough was actually kind of awesome. It worked really well, but we're not gonna go back to what FITC really stood for. All right, so there were a couple of good questions. One is we'll come back to this one. Maybe you can answer in the chat about all of the CSS named cats. I'm still lobbying for a small hedgehog named Min, but that's just
yeah. I will actually, because we haven't had much time. I will check out the chat in a bit and answer some questions in there. So feel free to stick stuff in there, and I'll come in there.
Yeah. Please do. But actually, the one thing I want to get to is around units, not the cats. We had a question from Marco about unit of measure recommending for media queries, and I'm wondering. I always tended to default to using M's. Does it matter that much?
I don't think it matters too much which unit you're using, as much as that you're not just arbitrarily sticking media queries in. I think this is going to become more important with container queries. You need to look at the content and say, well, at which point does this become too small? And it actually doesn't really matter what unit you're using to figure that out. I think M's are useful because obviously they're relating to the text size. So they also, if people have increased their font size, that's going to make a difference. But it depends, because if you're caring about the size of the screen, that's pixels probably works,
Right. Well, I guess one thing that always used to, I don't know if it still does this, but if you size them in M's, then if somebody uses page zoom, it would trip the media query. So you'd get the reflow, which I think tended to be a bonus when you were viewing stuff zoomed in, and pixels didn't do that. So that was why I had always used M's. Is that still the case, or?
I would have to check. I don't know offhand. Okay. But yeah, I think it is one of those things where, test obviously, because I think it depends on the sort of layout you're doing. But probably most importantly is take it from the content rather than doing this sort of. I think at one point, we'd get these lists, wouldn't we, of different sizes of devices. Which quickly became impossible to manage because there were so many devices all with different sizes.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, I think working from the content, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what people do with container queries in this space, and what becomes. I think we're too early to say what's best practice with that at this point,
right,
because there's people aren't using it in production. But it'd be really interesting to see what comes out of that as people do start doing it.
I know that there are a bunch of questions getting echoed by the FITC folks in the chat, so hopefully you'll get a chance to answer some more of those. I have a feeling that they'd like me to kind of wrap this up a bit and move on to the next section.
I will hop into the chat in a bit and try and answer some of them in text-based format, which is probably easier anyway a lot of the time. I can put links in then.
Awesome. Rachel, I can't thank you enough for the amazing content, but also your patience and your willingness to just start again so we could get everybody a more complete experience. Some stragglers got to not avoid missing anything in the first place. Thank you again. Can't wait to actually see you in person at some point soon, I hope. Best of luck with, I don't know, the naming of the next cat and all the other trips you've got coming up. And we'll talk to you again soon.